Chapter 1, we'll be talking about homeostasis. If you break down that word, homeo means the same, and stasis means to stay the same, which kind of seems like a redundant name. But the whole aim of homeostasis is to keep everything in the body within a stable range. For example, temperature, blood pressure, oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels, and so on, so that everything in our body has to remain within a normal range, and any deviation away from that range could lead to a pathology if the body is unable to correct it. So we will be talking about ways that the body can correct any imbalance of homeostasis. So that's basically what this chapter is going to be talking about. And with each chapter, you'll find a list of topics that we'll be discussing. For this chapter, we're basically going to be discussing the whole chapter, but you will see in, as we go through the course, sometimes there are parts where I feel like unless you're doing, say, a PhD in enzymes, maybe you don't really need to go that deep into the physiology of enzymes, okay? But for chapter 1, it's all important. So first off, we'll talk about the levels of cellular organization. What does that even mean? Well, it means that how do we take that individual unit of a cell and build it up until we make a human being or an organism. Since this is a human physiology course, we'll be talking about humans. So we start off with a fertilized egg, okay, so the egg and sperm unite. And then that fertilized egg is going to start dividing and making these what are known as undifferentiated stem cells or undifferentiated embryonic cells. Undifferentiated means that these cells have the ability to grow and become any cell in the body. So it might become a nerve cell, it might become a muscle cell, it could become a blood cell. We actually have no idea what's going to happen. Okay, so undifferentiated means that it has the ability to become any cell in the body. As the embryo grows and division, we start making more and more cells, a process known as differentiation is going to happen, meaning that now these cells are going to become more specialized cells. Okay, so we will have cells that are dedicated to become cells, say, of the nervous system, while another group will be dedicated to become cells of the muscular system, and so on. So those are known as differentiated cells. Okay, the kind of cells that we have in the body are basically categorized into one of 4. So they're either epithelial cells that will eventually make epithelial tissue, connective cells that will make connective tissue, neurons, and neurons is just a fancy term for nerve cells, and those will obviously become nervous tissue, and then muscle cells, and those will become parts of the muscle tissue. Okay, if you're not familiar with epithelial and connective, that's fine. We'll talk about them some time later throughout this chapter. Okay, when you bundle a group of these tissue together, so you take some epithelial and connective, some nerves and muscles, and you put them all together, you would be making an actual organ. Okay, so an organ, if you look at the microscopic structure of an organ, it will definitely have some epithelial tissue. It'll have some connective tissue that kind of connects all of these cells together. It has nervous tissue, and it also has smooth muscles. Smooth muscles are involuntary muscles. Okay, so don't think about muscles as just the muscles that we move our body with, and those are known as skeletal muscles. Those are voluntary muscles. But we also have involuntary muscles, and those are known as smooth muscles. And those are the muscles that you will find within organs. Okay, if you bunch a whole group of organs together and they have the same, function, for example, the kidney to make urine, ureters to take that urine into the bladder where it is stored and then eventually excreted through the urethra. So now we have made a system, an organ system dedicated to elimination, to the formation and elimination of urine. So that would be a urinary system. And then you would have to put a whole bunch of systems together, like the urinary, digestive, respiratory, reproductive, and so on. And that would end up making the organism that, again, in our course would be a human. So we'll talk about the different cells and different tissues. The only thing is that muscle cells and nervous tissue, those have a chapter dedicated to each one of them, so we're not going to go into details about them in chapter 1. But muscle cells, how do you know if you look at a cell and you are asked, like, what is that one thing that this cell has to have in order to become a muscle cell? And that would be to generate a mechanical force, meaning that it has to be able to contract. It has, think of it kind of like a rubber band where it has the ability, you can stretch it, and then it has the ability to contract back into shape. That ability of making mechanical force is a special character for muscle cells. Okay, there are 3 different kinds of muscle cells in the body. We've got cardiac muscle cells, and that is only found in the heart. Skeletal muscles, and those are attached to the skeleton, and those are the only muscles that are voluntary. Okay, these are the muscles that we can consciously control, like moving your arms, moving your legs, and so on. Smooth muscle fibers, those are the muscles that are found within the organs, for example, in your blood vessels, in the intestine, in the stomach. Those are involuntary muscles. Okay, so we cannot control our smooth muscle fibers. We have no control over the cardiac muscles either. So both of these are involuntary. Again, the only voluntary muscle fibers that we have are the skeletal muscles. Okay. Again, we're going to cover muscle cells, somewhere down in the course, so don't worry about more details about that. This is what we need to know for now. Now for the nervous tissue, neuron, as I said, is just a fancier term for nerve cell. Okay, and now how do we know that this is a nerve cell? Just like there was something characteristic of a muscle cell, now what is the distinguishing character of a neuron? Well, that would be the ability to conduct an electrical impulse. That electrical impulse is known as an action potential. So if you see the action potential, now you know what it is. It is the electricity that passes on a nerve, and you would sometimes see it abbreviated as AP. Okay. If you put a lot of neurons together, that would make, you can make a brain, you can make a spinal cord, and again, more detail will definitely be coming our way later on in chapter 6. Now for epithelial and connective tissue. Okay, for epithelial cells, you want to think of epithelial cells as whatever covers the body on the outside. Okay, so skin, hair, nails, all of that is epithelial tissue. It is also the lining on the inside of the body. So on the outside, we have all of these orifices. We have the oral cavity, the nasal cavity, the anal cavity, and so on. All of them are lined with epithelial cells. Okay, so the lining on the inside and the exterior part of us, so our skin, that is epithelial cells. Epithelial cells are also any cell in the body that has the ability to secrete something. So glands, for instance, are all made out of special kinds of epithelium. And the cells that are able to absorb things, like the cells lining the intestines, for instance. Okay, so epithelial, again, are those cells that have the ability to either secrete something or absorb something. And it also lines the inside of the viscera, and it lines the outside of the body. Okay. So you kind of maybe want to think of epithelial cells kind of like when you look at a house from the outside, you can see the bricks, okay, so our skin on the outside, and then there's maybe wallpaper on the inside. So that would be the linings of the viscera on our insides. Epithelial, because there's a lot of different organs, we have different kinds of epithelium, and they look different, okay? So we name them according to their shapes. If the shape of the cell is cuboidal, okay, well, that's the name, cuboidal, it'll be cube-shaped. If the cell is elongated, we call it a columnar epithelium. If it's a flat shape cell, we call it squamous. Some people call it squamous. I can tend to call it squamous. And sometimes they would have cilia. Cilia are kind of like hair-like projections off of cells. So we name them according to what do these cells look like. And we also name the epithelium according to how many layers of cells are on top of each other. So if we only have one single layer, we call it simple epithelium. But if there are numerous layers of cells on top of each other, we are going to name that now stratified epithelium. So I'll ask you something, and you try to figure out what kind of cell am I talking about. So if I say that the air sacs or the alveoli are lined by one layer of flat epithelium, so what will we name that epithelium? Well, it's one layer, so it's simple. And then it's flat epithelium, so it's squamous. So we will call that simple squamous epithelium. Okay. Another example would be skin. Skin is made out of multiple layers of flat cells. So multiple layers would be stratified epithelium. And because, again, multiple layers of flat cells, that would be a stratified squamous epithelium, and so on. Okay, so you have to be able to name it according to the number of layers and what do these cells look like. The kind of epithelium is important because different epithelium have different functions. So depending on where you are in the body, we are going to need different kinds of cells. For example, and we'll kind of use the example that's in the text, that the trachea, which is the windpipe, that is made of ciliated epithelial cells. So these cells have cilia, which are these like hair-like projections out of the cell that help push out any dust or any foreign bodies trying to get into the lungs. Okay, so again, you will always see that the structure of an organ helps its function. So we already talked about, kind of discussed that epithelial cells are found on the surfaces that cover the body, and it lines the inner parts. It lines anything that's tubular. Okay, so the esophagus, the trachea, the urethra, all of these are tubular structures. Hollow structures like the stomach, the urinary bladder, the gallbladder, and so on. All of those are lined from the inside by epithelium as well. Now, what anchors these epithelial cells to the rest of the cells, or to the connective tissue? Well, there is the function of the basement membrane. The basement membrane separates the epithelial cells on one side from the connective tissue or the connective cells on the other side. And we'll see that kind of like when we get to the next slide. So we'll kind of go to the next slide right away. So this right here is a tubular lumen. You could think of it maybe as the intestines. Okay, and here you could see that it's lined by epithelial cells. That blue line right here is your basement membrane. And anything on this side of the basement membrane is considered connective tissue. So all of that tissue between the blue basement membrane and that blood vessel is considered connective tissue. Now this epithelial cell has two sides. This side right here that is towards the lumen, that is known as the apical membrane. While the other side that is towards the basement membrane, that is known as the basolateral membrane. So again, the part that attaches to the basement membrane is kind of named according to the basement membrane, so basolateral membrane, while the other side that is facing the lumen of the tube is known as the apical membrane. And again, you can see that basement membrane separating the epithelium from the connective tissue. But these cells, they do kind of hold hands, and these junctions are known as tight junctions. We'll be talking about different kinds of junctions, I believe maybe in chapter 2 in more detail. So that's epithelial tissue. So we talked about the epithelium, we talked about nervous and muscle tissue. Anything else in the body is considered connective tissue. Connective tissue comes from the function that it really connects and anchors and supports the different structures of the body. The different kinds of connective tissue we've got, loose connective tissue, so depending on, how compact the cells are, if they are densely compacted together, we'll call them dense connective tissue. Some connective tissue, or the only connective tissue really that's liquid, would be your blood. The only connective tissue that's solid are bones. And then we have these, kind of more special kind of connective tissue, for example, cartilage and adipose tissue. Adipose tissue means fat cells, or the fatty tissue. Now, all connective tissue is made out of cells that are embedded within an extracellular matrix. So we would have extracellular matrix made out of maybe protein or minerals or polysaccharides, which are big sugar molecules. And swimming within that matrix, we would have some cells, depending again on what kind of connective tissue we're talking about. So, for example, in blood, the cells would be the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Okay, and the matrix in this case would be the plasma with everything that is circulating in there. So again, for all of these types of connective tissues, you are going to have certain kinds of cells that are embedded within a matrix. So we kind of already, introduced what surrounds these cells, okay, is known as your extracellular matrix, and that could be either a mixture of protein, polysaccharides, minerals, or what have you, depending again on where you are in the body. And it really has two functions. Okay, the extracellular matrix has two functions. First off, somehow these cells that are circulating in there, they have to have a way to connect together. Okay, so it's a method of cellular attachment, and cells have to be able to communicate together. Okay, so there is, whether they're communicating through hormones or nerves or what have you, there has to be a way for these messengers to go from one cell to another in order for them to regulate their activities. Now, since we kind of touched a little bit on extracellular matrix and fluids, so we want to talk about body fluid compartments. When we talk about body fluids, we are going to be discussing really any fluid that is found in the body, okay? And I kind of want to go straight to the image in order to explain this. I'll go back to all of this in 1 minute. But our total body water, most of it, okay, so about 65% of our total body water is found within the cell, inside of the cell, and that is known as intracellular water or intracellular fluid. While the remaining about 30% or the remaining 35% is extracellular, would be outside of the cell. So we know that a cell is made out of a cell membrane with the cytoplasm and all of the organelles in there. Now, most of our body water, about 65% of it, is found within our cells, intracellular. The remaining 30 to 35% is found outside of the cell, extracellular fluid. Now, for that 33%, okay, 25% is interstitial. Interstitial means between our cells, while 8% is plasma. Plasma means that it is inside of a blood vessel. Okay, so if you look at this image right here, we will find that, if this kind of represents all of our body fluid, 65% will be found within these cells, intracellularly, while 33% would be extracellular, and that would be the plasma, about 8% that is circulating within the blood vessels, and about 25% interstitial fluid. Again, interstitial fluid would be the fluid that is found in between our cells. Okay, so we'll go back to these just to make sure that we didn't forget mentioning anything. Okay, so all of these fluids differ in their composition, meaning that they have different sodium, potassium, glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide levels. They are very dynamic and very, they're not constant. Okay, so the differences in fluid composition is extremely important for cells to perform their function. And when we get to, say, exchange of gas in the lungs or exchange of gas in the tissue, we will understand how that difference in composition, difference in chemistry affects their functions. Important to know what is the main intracellular cation, which is a positive ion found inside of the cell. The main cation is potassium, while the main extracellular cation, so the main positive ion found outside of the cell, is sodium. This is extremely important when we talk about the nervous system and how electricity is propagated along the nerve. It is also really important when we talk about how a muscle contracts. So you want to keep those, somewhere in the back of your head. We're definitely going to need that when we talk about those two systems. Now, what is homeostasis? Homeostasis, as we mentioned already, it means that anything within our body needs to be within a normal range. That could be literally anything, okay? So body temperature, blood pressure, oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels, sodium, chloride, potassium, anything within your body, if you can think of it, it needs to stay within a predictable range. When there is a mess of that homeostasis, or if there's an imbalance, okay, the body has a way of correcting that. And if it is unable to correct that, that's when pathology happens. That's when we become sick or ill because our body failed to maintain homeostasis. Do know that homeostasis, though, is a very dynamic process, meaning that over the day, my glucose levels are going to vary. They'll go up and down, okay? So it's not the same level throughout the 24 hours. It does go up and down, but it ranges, that range is within normal range, okay? So it is a very dynamic process. It is not a static process. When homeostasis is maintained, that's what physiology is. Okay, if we remain within normal range, we're in balance, then we're good and we're healthy, we're physiologically fine. But when our body fails to keep us within normal range, that's when a pathology occurs. We call that pathophysiology. So here you can see, for instance, over a range of 24 hours, glucose levels. So you'll see here that right before, after breakfast, the glucose level goes up a little bit and then it gradually goes back down, remains constant until after lunch, it goes back up again. And then after dinner, it spikes back and then goes back down to normal. So although the levels are going up and down throughout the day, so it's the glucose levels again are dynamic, but throughout the 24 hours, we're still within normal range. Okay, so that is an example of dynamic constancy, where the levels are going to change and vary over short periods of time, but when you look at the bigger picture, they're still within normal range. Now, what is the homeostatic mechanism? Or how does the body know that something is wrong and it needs to correct it? We have sensors within our body, everywhere within the body, that are detecting different levels of different things. Okay, so we have sensors for blood pressure. Those are known as baroreceptors. We have sensors for temperature. Those are known as thermoreceptors. We have sensors for oxygen and carbon dioxide. Since those are chemicals, those are known as chemoreceptors. So we'll talk about the example that's here on the slide where, let's say we're in a very cold room and we're losing a lot of heat from our body and our body temperature goes down. There is a sensor that will detect that decrease in body temperature. Those sensors are known as receptors because it receives that information. In this case, we are talking about a thermoreceptor. Now, what does the body do now that it knows that the body is too cold? Well, it takes that information to the thermostat, and the thermostat in our body is found in the brain in a place known as the hypothalamus, and it will compare your body temperature to the set point. And your body kind of talks to itself, okay, so I should be at about 38 degrees, but it's cold in this room and I'm at about 36. So what am I going to do to make sure that my body temperature remains at 38? So what it does is that your brain sends out impulses to what are known as the effectors. And effectors are the parts of the body that are going to make the necessary changes. So for example, it'll send out impulses to your muscles to shiver, okay, and that will increase heat production. Excuse me. It'll also send out impulses to the smooth muscles of the blood vessels of the skin to constrict. So when we're cold, we are a little bit pale, and that paleness happens because of the constriction of the blood vessels of the skin, so that we're keeping the blood away from the surface and keeping it deep within the organs that really need that warmth, like the kidneys and the heart. Okay, so all of that is going to decrease the heat loss from the body. And it also initiates that curling up, or us kind of, putting on maybe an additional layer of clothes or doing something to keep us warm. So your body, basically what it did is decrease the heat loss from the body while increasing the heat production, and that will produce the effect of returning your body temperature back to normal. Okay, so that again is how your homeostatic mechanism works. The body was able to detect a change, and it was able to send impulses or send orders to different parts of the body to reverse the change. That is known as negative feedback. Okay, so we have these control systems that where the body, if the body detects any change or any deviation away from normal, it wants to bring it back to the original set point. And that is known again as negative feedback. So negative feedback is a process where the response, it will be opposite to the direction of the original change. Meaning that in the example that we talked about, the body temperature went down and the response of the body was to bring the temperature back up to normal. Okay, so that's negative feedback, where the response is opposite to the direction of your change. And that is the majority of feedback loops within our body. We do have a couple of examples of positive feedback where the body detects a change, and instead of trying to bring things back to normal, it actually enhances that change. Okay, it magnifies the change. So we'll give you the example, and I think that will kind of help explain what that means. So for example, uterine contractions during child labor. So under normal circumstances, the uterus is relaxed. It's made out of smooth muscles, and it is a relaxed organ. But during delivery, the smooth muscles start contraction. So that is a deviation away from normal physiology. So according to negative feedback, okay, if the body would want to stop these contractions, but then the baby won't be delivered. So what the body does is actually positive feedback. So when the uterus starts to contract, instead of stopping the contractions, it enhances and magnifies these contractions, making it stronger and stronger until that baby is actually delivered. Okay, so your positive feedback is going to push you further away from normal until you reach the goal. And the goal in this example is child labor or delivery of a child. Okay, another example of positive feedback would be blood clotting. Whenever we are injured, okay, our blood needs to clot in order to stop the bleeding. Which again, blood clotting is a deviation away from norm. If the small blood clot forms, negative, but if we're using negative feedback, that would mean that we would stop clotting, but we're still bleeding. Okay, so positive feedback is what would happen in this case, where the blood would keep on clotting until the bleeding stops. When bleeding stops, that's when your body can go back to normal. Okay, so the major differences between them, negative feedback is when the body will produce a response opposite to the change, while in positive feedback, it would enhance and magnify the change. This is another negative feedback loop. Okay, so let us take an example here of an enzyme that is made out of, a hormone that starts off as cholesterol and would go through a series of reactions to end up becoming cortisol. Okay, so cortisol is a stress hormone, and it is made when our body synthesizes it or makes it. It starts off with cholesterol molecules. So that cholesterol molecules, again, through a series of reactions, will end up being cortisol, and that would be your end product. So how much cortisol does your body need? When we reach that needed level, the body, through negative feedback, will inhibit that very first enzyme within that, that chain of reaction to stop producing more cortisol. You want to think of it kind of like an assembly line where, let's say, we need to make 100 cars. When those cars are made, when we have our products at the end, 100 cars are made. Well, all you have to do is tell that very first worker, you know what, we've made the 100 cars, you can stop the assembly line. And that is what our body does. It'll take your substrate, which in our example is the cholesterol. It'll go through that assembly line, make enough cortisol, and when our body has enough, through negative feedback, you see that minus sign, through negative feedback, it will inhibit the very first enzyme within the chemical reaction. And that very first enzyme is known as the rate limiting enzyme. So again, on that assembly line, you're not going to tell that very last worker to stop working. Once you're done with your 100 cars, you'll tell the first one to stop working. Okay, because you don't want to keep on making more. This is the person that starts the whole process. So your very first enzyme is your rate limiting enzyme. So a couple of important things that we need to know about homeostatic mechanisms. First of all, that we have to balance intake and output. For example, let's take water, for instance. So the amount of water that we intake per day, we want to balance that with the amount of output. Meaning that, intake of water, we take water mainly by drinking, but some with food as well. And the output, you have to balance how much urine the body makes, how much sweat occurred throughout the day, and so on. So there's a whole balance of input and output, and it's really up to the body to kind of figure out what kind of balance or to... Okay, I'll give you an example. So let's say, for instance, that it's a cold day and we're sitting all day, in the cold, very minimal sweat, no exercise, so we don't need a lot of water, and our body will kind of be concentrating the urine a little bit, okay, because we're not taking in water. But let's say we drink a lot of water. Okay, now we have too much water coming in under the circumstances, and our kidneys, through that feedback and through homeostatic mechanisms, will be making now more urine to get rid of all of that extra water that I don't need. Okay, so it's all about balancing kind of, the input and output of different things. Okay, we already talked about how negative feedback is the ability to make the body go in the opposite direction of the original change. Okay, the homeostatic mechanisms is very dynamic. There is no such thing as a static control. So your body, your glucose levels are never the same throughout the 24 hours. It goes up and down, but the bigger picture is that it's within normal range. We do have different set points for different things. So normal glucose levels is definitely different than normal sodium levels or normal oxygen levels and so on. So we do have, that set points for different things within the body. And the body has the ability to change that set point as well, depending on the needs of the body. Okay. If more than one thing is out of balance, okay, so let's say that oxygen levels are abnormal, so are magnesium levels within the blood. Well, the body has to prioritize, okay, so which one of the two do you think is more important, the oxygen or the magnesium? Well, it's definitely the oxygen, so the body will make sure that it figures out a way to bring oxygen levels back to normal, and then it will worry about the magnesium levels. Okay, so there is really, the body has to prioritize what it needs to correct first. Now we'll talk about reflexes, which kind of ties into homeostasis. Okay, so a reflex, that is an involuntary, unpremeditated built-in response to a particular stimulus. So it is really not something that we control. We don't say, well, you know what, I got pricked, so let me think for a minute if I want to move my hand or not. It is a reflex. It is involuntary response. It is built in. We're wired to do these reflexes. Okay, so for example, we'll use this example right here that, pulling your finger away from a hot object. Okay, and we'll use this to go over the different parts of a reflex. So this right here is the stimulus. Okay, that heat is the stimulus. There is your first part of the reflex is the receptor. The receptor, again, in this case, we are either feeling the temperature, so it could be thermoreceptor, or we'll be feeling pain, and that is known as a nociceptor, N-O-C-I receptor. Whatever kind of receptor it is, it will take that impulse through that blue sensory neuron, okay, because the nerve that carries sensation or senses is known as a sensory neuron or an afferent with an A, and take that information into the spinal cord. Most reflexes, most of these built-in reflexes do not reach the brain. So that would actually take more time in order for it to ascend all the way up to the brain, and the brain has to think about it, send down the order to your skeletal muscle to contract. So most of these reflexes occur on the level of the spinal cord. So we'll start over again. So number one, first part of the reflex is your receptor, and then there is the blue sensory neuron or afferent. It takes the information into the spinal cord, and then there's a yellow interneuron. Interneuron means in between neurons. That takes the info from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. A motor neuron, or an efferent with an E, is the nerve that takes the order from the spinal cord down to the effector. In this case, it is the skeletal muscle that will contract. Okay, know that the reflexes and the different parts of the reflexes are really important, so I would recommend maybe going over this one more time. Okay. Know that the fifth component here is the effector. The effector can either be a muscle or a gland. In this example, it is a skeletal muscle. The reflexes, all of them are within an arc, the reflex arc, and we talked about the components of the reflex arc. We've got the receptor, there is the sensory neuron, interneuron. Just know that not all reflexes have interneurons, some do, some don't. And then there is a motor neuron, and then the effector. Okay, so those are your parts of the reflex arc. The integrating center, that is your interneuron. Okay. Integrating center basically means that it is going to take the sensory neuron, take that information, and kind of relay it to the motor neuron. So it's kind of like the person, so to speak, that talks between these two neurons. Here is a general, kind of like a composite of the reflex arc. So again, the stimulus in this example, it was that flame or the burning sensation. And then the parts that are within the body, you have the receptor, and then the sensory neuron or an afferent neuron that will take you to the integrating center, or the interneuron. It compares it to a set point, so obviously we shouldn't be in pain. Okay, and that interneuron will send an impulse through the motor pathway or the efferent neuron to the effector. The effector, again, could either be a muscle or a gland. In this example, it is a skeletal muscle, and that effector will produce the response, which is the contraction and withdrawal of the hand. That right here is negative feedback. So you are removing that stimulus and removing that change in the harmful change in the environment that the body was exposed to. Now, things that can be parts of the reflex component, we already talked about how effectors could sometimes be glands as well. Like as I mentioned, they could be muscles or glands. And remember, we have 3 different kinds of muscles. So it won't be skeletal muscles all the time. It could be cardiac muscle or smooth muscles, and glands sometimes too. Okay, these glands are going to make hormones, and those hormones will be released from the gland, will circulate throughout the bloodstream, and reach the target cells in order to produce an effect. Now, since we talked about chemical messengers, let's talk about the different kinds of chemical messengers. Intercellular chemical messengers, meaning that these are messages in between cells. So we have hormones and we have neurotransmitters. Hormones are made by glands. Those glands are known as the endocrine glands. Sometimes endocrine glands can basically be just kind of like cells that are scattered throughout the body. The point is that these cells secrete hormones. Those chemicals will be distributed through the bloodstream in order to reach their target cells. Okay, so hormones, again, made by endocrine glands, circulate throughout the bloodstream to reach their target. While neurotransmitters, well, these are chemicals made by nerves, hence the name neurotransmitters, and they are going to propagate or pass through, travel on the nerve in order to reach another nerve or to reach a muscle or a gland. Okay, so these neurotransmitters, they have their pathway. They have a nerve to follow in order to reach something else, while hormones have to circulate throughout the bloodstream in order to reach their target. Sometimes these chemicals can be both. Okay, so we'll go over an example. For instance, norepinephrine, which is another name for noradrenaline, found in the brain, it acts as a neurotransmitter. So it is in the brain, it will be a chemical that transmits information between neurons. But in the body, norepinephrine is made by a gland found on top of the kidney known as the adrenal gland. And then it circulates throughout the bloodstream to reach targets far away from that gland. So in that case, it is a hormone. Okay, so norepinephrine has the ability, it's just one example of a chemical messenger that has the ability to be either a neurotransmitter or a hormone. We also have chemicals that can be paracrine. Paracrine means a hormone that is going to, a chemical messenger that will affect neighboring cells. So para means neighbors. Or an autocrine substance. Autocrine is a chemical messenger that is going to affect that same cell that actually made it. So there are pictures somewhere, there we go, that help explaining these. So in a gland, that gland will make a hormone that would have to go through blood vessels in order to reach their targets. While neurotransmitters are made by nerves, and they help transmit the electrical signals from one nerve to another nerve or to a muscle or a gland. So whatever is on that other side of this nerve. A paracrine substance, that is a chemical messenger made by a cell, and it will just diffuse and spread to the neighboring cells. So remember that para means neighboring or close by cells. An autocrine substance is a chemical messenger made by a cell, and it affects that exact same cell. So auto means self. Paracrine and autocrine substances are really important, especially when we'll talk about the immune system. We'll talk about a lot of paracrine and autocrine chemical messengers. Now, there are different other kinds of communication besides, hormones or neurotransmitters. Sometimes cells are so close to each other that they don't really need a signal or chemicals to relay the messages. For example, we have these gap junctions. Gap junctions are basically tunnels between two cells. So the two cells have these little channels or tunnels connecting the cytoplasms of these two cells together. So things can actually just, very easily kind of go from the cytoplasm of one cell to the next. Okay, so these are known as gap junctions. Juxtacrine signaling or contact dependent would be where one cell would have the messenger or the chemical messenger on its surface membrane. So it won't release it in the bloodstream like a gland would do, but it makes the chemical messenger, it keeps it, so that little red rod, it'll keep it on the cell membrane. And then it's not until it meets the target cell and they connect together, they kind of fit in like two pieces of a puzzle. So, and that is when it produces its effect. And that's why it's known as a contact-dependent communication. Now, a little bit about the difference between adaptation and acclimatization. So we talked, and this ties into homeostasis because the body, again, tries to detect any change and tries to correct it. Well, sometimes the body has to acclimate, has to really change itself in order to adapt to its surrounding. So what is the difference between adaptation and acclimatization? They are both really changes that occur in the body. One is permanent, and that is adaptation, while the other is temporary, and that is acclimatization. So for example, if you go to an area, to a tropical area, for instance, where it is really hot, there's lots of sun, and in order for your body to acclimate itself to that now, to all of that sun, you start getting a tan. Okay, so that tan is your body protecting you from that extra sun exposure, but it is a temporary change. Okay, so that improved the functioning of an already existing homeostatic system. So you already have that melanin, but it increased the production of melanin in order to acclimate and protect you from all of that extra sun. Again, this is a temporary change. It is reversible. Adaptation, though, is permanent. Okay, so for instance, the long necks of zebras. Okay, the long neck is is an adaptation that happened to them over the years because of the need to reach those high trees, and it's also a way to lose body heat. That increase in surface area allows for the radiation of more heat, and that allowed them to adapt to their environment. That adaptation, though, is permanent. So even if you take a zebra and you put them in the North Pole, where it's freezing, their necks are not going to get shorter. Okay, so that adaptation is a permanent change that occurred. Now, biological rhythms is your body's way of going through these cycles approximately every 24 hours. The center or the pacemaker for your circadian rhythm, which is your 24-hour rhythm, is found in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a part of the brain that is part nervous tissue, part glandular tissue. So it acts as a part of the nervous system, and it also acts as part of the endocrine system that makes hormones. And the hypothalamus is that connection between these two systems, and in some textbooks, they even talk about it as a neuroendocrine system. The hypothalamus is full of nerve cells, different collections of nerve cells within the brain would be known as a nucleus. The nucleus that is responsible for our circadian rhythms is known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Supra means above. Chiasm is part of the optic nerve, the nerve that we see with. Okay, so this nucleus is found right on top of a part of the optic nerve known as the chiasm. So it's known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus. It is set where we will wake up and go to sleep with, that fluctuation of wakefulness and sleepiness, with the fluctuation of body temperature that happens over the day, the variation of hormonal levels, whether on a daily basis or on a monthly basis in females. A lot of this is really controlled by the hypothalamus. Okay, so if any idea what the bunker experiment is, if you're not familiar with it, I'll let you guys kind of watch that video and let me know your thoughts about it in the open forum that happens to be on Moodle. It's not a graded assignment, but it's a fun experiment that was done, I believe, maybe in the 60s or 70s or something. And it really tested that circadian rhythm. So in short, what these scientists did was they put people in bunkers where they had no way of telling what time of the day it was. Was it day or night? Nothing. And they were thinking that these individuals won't be able to maintain a circadian rhythm. They would not be able to tell when they're supposed to go to sleep or when to wake up and so on, that everything would, that the body would lose control of its homeostatic rhythm or of its circadian rhythm. So watch the experiment and, kind of see what happened to these individuals. So you can see here circadian rhythm for body temperature, from 6 a.m. all the way back to 6 a.m. the next day. Okay, so you can, and it's tied to cortisol levels. So we wake up and that cortisol levels go up high, okay, throughout the day. Cortisol, again, is your stress hormone, but which doesn't mean that we're all stressed out throughout the day. It's just normal to have higher cortisol levels throughout the day. And then when we go fall asleep, cortisol levels go down. And then towards the end of the night, it gradually goes up until, we're at a level where we wake up again, and that rhythm keeps on going every 24 hours. Okay, so again, that circadian rhythm of cortisol is also controlled by the hypothalamus. So what do you think happened to these patients or these through that bunkers experiment? Did their cortisol levels go out of whack? Were their sleeping cycles all disturbed? Take a watch and let us know your thoughts. So what is the relationship between biological rhythms and homeostasis? Is that biological rhythms is homeostasis plus an anticipatory component, okay? Meaning that, kind of going back to this right here, meaning that throughout the night, our cortisol levels are way too low, and then it gradually goes up because the body is anticipating us to wake up at 6 o'clock. So our body does not wait until we wake up to increase our cortisol levels. Since it already knows that we are going to wake up at 6, it'll start increasing the cortisol that we need to go throughout the day before we wake up. Okay, so it anticipates the changes that we do on a daily basis in order to prepare us for that. Think about another thing, like if you're used to eating lunch every single day at 12 noon, okay, for the last 10 years, what happens if you skip lunch today? Well, at noon, you are going to be hungry, okay? Again, so your body anticipates that at noon you eat. If that doesn't happen, your body is going to stay on that rhythm. Okay, so the biological rhythm, keep on doing that, adds that anticipatory component to your homeostatic mechanism. Negative, but we are able to correct those rhythms if the rhythm is disturbed. So think about jet lag. Okay, when you go somewhere, and I don't mean like going to Ohio, for example, like a 3 or 4 hour drive, but I mean, gone on a plane 10 hours or 12 hours away, and where there is at least about maybe 8 hours of jet lag. Okay, so your rhythm that you're used to is totally different than the rhythm of that new place where you've arrived. You are going to keep, your body will remain on the cycle from, your original area. It will take a couple of days until your rhythm syncs with what it's seeing on the outside. So it sees on the outside that it's daytime. I should be awake, but my body is telling me, but it's nighttime in the US. I should be sleeping. It takes maybe up to from 10 days to 2 weeks sometimes, depending on age and depending on how bad the lag is, in order for the body to correct that biological rhythm. Okay, so our body does have the ability to do that. And again, it does that through a negative feedback homeostatic mechanism. Okay, so going back to that anticipatory effect, again, if you're used to waking up every single day at 6 o'clock in the morning for the past 10 years, and then you decide to take a day off and sleep in, you turn off your alarm, guess what's going to happen? You're going to wake up at 6 a.m., okay? Because your body is already adjusted. You already have that internal alarm in you that is going to wake you up at 6. So our body really needs to be in that state of balance, okay? It needs to figure out how much is coming in, how much of everything really is coming in, and how much am I losing of all of these different chemicals. And what you really want is this stable balance where the gain is equal to the loss. Okay, you do not want a negative balance or a positive balance. Okay, we'll think of these kind of like in terms of water intake. So if somebody is losing much more water than they're gaining, okay, then they will become dehydrated. That is known as a negative balance. While on the other hand, if somebody is drinking way too much water, then they're actually urinating or losing. So they are overhydrated. That can lead to a lot of different things, and that is known as a positive balance. So negative balance and positive balance are both things that the body does not want to do. We want to be in this stable balance where the amount of water intake is equal to the amount of water loss. Okay, that ends chapter 1.